Hi guys, welcome to this new session of CFA Level 2. Today we'll be starting with the next major topic that we have, which is corporate finance. Now, in corporate finance, you have a total of 5 readings, and the readings that are connected with Level 1, they take up right from where you left at Level 1. So we have capital budgeting, we have cost of capital. These are the two readings that are connected with what you studied at Level 1, and these pick up exactly where you left off at Level 1. Aside from that, there are also two readings which are sort of new, but they build on the topics that you've already covered at level 1. You have mergers and acquisitions, and you also have dividends and share repurchase. So a total of four of the major readings. The fifth reading, very similar to the fifth reading you had in level 1 also, which is corporate governance, one of the most favorite topics of all the students. Now, the reason why I'll be taking corporate governance first, so today's session would be all about corporate governance. There is one very simple reason. See, if I take up all the other subjects, there is a good chance a lot of students also, when they study, they focus on the other four readings, and by the time they get to corporate governance, they just feel like this is not as important. Now, till some part, I would agree that yes, this is not the sole focus of CF Institute either from corporate finance, but there is one very specific reason why I like to prefer this reading at first. This reading takes the least amount of effort from all the corporate finance readings. And if you get one or two questions from it, there's a good chance for just an hour or so of study time, you're going to get guaranteed good score in those one or two questions. So the return on the amount of time you're investing is exceptionally high from this reading. And I don't want a situation where we leave this for the last and then this is one of those readings that stays left till the very last day, where maybe in the end, if you get a time, a lot of students give it a read. I don't want that for you guys. So let's start with corporate governance. The first topic that we have is discussing about various ownership structures. Now, ownership structure by itself is a very important part of corporate governance because the entire concept of corporate governance stems from just one major issue that was being observed. What used to happen is equity shareholders or the common shareholders, they are the owners of the company, but they don't actually run the operations of the company. The operations are run by management. So there became two different parties, management and shareholders. Shareholders want the value of the shares to be maximized. Management may not always want the same thing. So there can be a conflict between what the management wants and what the shareholders want. And in order to solve this conflict, or at least resolve it till some degree, we have the concept of corporate governance. So first thing is to understand different types of ownership structures that we can have. Now, ownership structure is relevant because it has two elements to it, which we'll cover in the second part. First is just owning the shares. How much of the company do you own? Then there's also a part about voting. How much voting power do you own? Now, in most of the countries, the simple structure that we observe with most of the companies and countries also is that you have one vote for one share, and that structure works the same way as we have elections in the country. Every person gets one vote, and each vote has equal value. So that's the structure we have. But there can be situations where ownership is spread across a lot of people. Maybe the voting has some legal repercussions. Some countries allow having dual share categories where you can have two different types of common shares. One will have more voting power than the other. So those are also various cases that could create conflict within the ownership structures itself. So we'll look over those as well. Firstly, let's talk about vertical and horizontal ownership. Now, these are two types of ownerships that you can have. These are not to be confused with any of the other things we'll be covering. These are sort of two separate categories. Now, what happens is we have two kinds of structure. One is where we have a parent company, then a subsidiary company, maybe a subsidiary of subsidiary. So in that case, what happens is you have one company at the top controlling and owning the second company, which may control and own some other subsidiaries. It creates a vertical chain. That kind of ownership is known as vertical, where the parent company automatically can influence the ownership or the operations of subsidiary of subsidiary. So if I have company A, parent, it owns B, which owns C. C's operations can be influenced by A. So A may not directly own the shares of C, but it can influence the operations of C. So A would be sort of a vertical owner of C in that particular situation, indirect ownership of sorts. Horizontal ownership happens normally not in cases where you own a lot of shares, but this is a case where companies within the same sector often have cross shareholding. So, for example, I have three companies in the same sector, so X, Y, Z, all three operating in, let's say, chemical industries. X owns 10% of Y, Y owns 15% of X. Similarly, 5% of Z is held by Y. We can have something like 10% being held by Z, and XZ might also hold shares of each other. Now, this structure, it might look confusing, and some people might think, why exactly do we need this? Well, there is one very common element. Some industries have a feature where, let's say, these are all chemical companies which are into pharmaceutical manufacturing. They make some chemicals which are useful for making pharmaceutical drugs. Maybe they all have a common supplier, and that supplier is probably the biggest supplier in the market. There isn't a possibility where either of these companies can lose that supplier and move on to someone else. Now, in order to avoid a situation where in the future, if that supplier decides to stop the supply to company X and give more of supply to Y and Z, that would leave company X hanging. In order to avoid that situation, companies, just to safeguard some of those risks, what they do is they buy some shares of their other competitors also, so that if in the future the supplier decides to cut off company X entirely, yes, their operations would be affected, but because they are owning some part of other operations of Y and Z, they won't necessarily go out of business completely. They'll still have some sort of risk coverage. It's not 100% risk coverage like an insurance, but at least some of it is covered, so that they don't necessarily go out of business immediately, but rather they can plan how they are going to now correct the situation. So in these situations, you can have horizontal ownership. And this entire chapter, you'll have various meanings. So make sure you're comfortable with all the definitions and meanings that we cover. Now, let's move on to the conflict of ownership and control. We already discussed it in brief. We can have different ownership structures compared to different voting patterns.